Hi, everybody, and welcome to a special one-on-one edition of Newsmakers. I'm Jerry Roberts. It is Monday, October 28th, only 8 days before the election. So you better get on those passport renewals and dual citizenship applications for Canada, Croatia, or the Cook Island. Joining me this morning to discuss this and other related matters is Robin Acarian, the great opinion page columnist for the Los Angeles Times. Robin, thank you so much for joining us on Newsmakers.
My pleasure. My pleasure.
Robin was born in Berkeley, raised in Southern California, earned her BA at Cal, go Bears, and a master's in journalism from Boston University, go Terriers. I don't know about
Right.
Bears and the Terriers. She has had several incarnations in her 3 decades at the Los Angeles Times. Most recently, her column on the editorial pages, which began in 2019. And I also want to note that Robin will be the keynote speaker 1 week after the election at the Women's Political Committee annual anniversary bash, and I'll leave more information about that in the show notes. So, Robin, your talk in Santa Barbara is scheduled 1 week after the election, so I assume you're doing two completely different versions of your major policy address. But let me ask you about
Yeah.
something that we know is going to be true, whether, no matter who wins, and that is this huge gender gap in the election. You and I have been writing about gender gap since probably the 80s, but I mean, it's really off the charts this year. Uh, uh, Unpack that for me a little bit. What are some of the reasons that you see for why it's so dramatic, and what effect do you think it'll have on the election?
Well, I think there's always been, in the last several decades, a gender gap in the presidential election. But I think this year it's particularly acute because of all the anti-abortion stuff, the Trump anti-abortion laws, the Dobbs ruling. I think women are in many places up in arms about this. And, even women who sort of are on the fence about who to vote for, I think can be pushed over. At least that's what I'm hearing from my friends who've been canvassing, that reproductive rights really looms as an important topic for so many women. Not to mention the Republican candidates' really awful treatment of women, his history of sexual assault, his convictions, his wife cheating, his just the nasty things he says about women. And he continues it. He doesn't ever soften his rhetoric. Just at Madison Square Garden, there was name calling against Kamala Harris. Just the inability to pronounce her name correctly. It's just, I think women are kind of pissed off, to be honest. And I think this is why the 2022 midterms, for example, which came after Dobbs, were such a resounding success for Democrats. And the red wave that was expected and anticipated didn't happen because women were so angry about a right that they had for 50 years, almost 50 years, being ripped out from under them. In a way, I think that's unprecedented in American history. And there's going to be more of it. I mean, if Project 2025 can be believed, and Donald Trump, he's trying to soften his position on abortion. And if you've seen JD Vance completely backpedaling, saying, "Oh, I have a friend who had an abortion and I love her and I totally understand why," which is uh, basically a contradiction of everything they've embraced and stood for. So they're trying to pull the wool up over women voters' eyes, I think. And what's been really interesting for me to watch is how Democrats are responding to this. For example, in Kalamazoo over the weekend, Michelle Obama took to the stage and basically said, women, between us, your husband doesn't know how you're voting when you go into that voting booth. Vote for your rights, vote for yourself, vote for your children, your daughters, your granddaughters. And then she said, and I thought this was really interesting, she said, men, you need to treat the women in your lives better. You need, actually, she said, to do better by us. And that appeal to men, I think, could potentially be pretty powerful. Um, so I'm anticipating that the gender gap is going to be driven a lot by the Dobbs decision and a lot by these draconian efforts in so many states to make abortion completely illegal. And as we know, the rate of abortion has not slowed down. And women are dying who are having miscarriages or having, pregnancies with fetuses that are incompatible with life. So women are left to die in parking lots thanks to this boneheaded decision by the Supreme Court.
Yeah. And there's also this not very subtle strain of misogyny that's kind of running through the Trump campaign, through Trump himself, but manifest in the great J.D. Vance. And you've written columns about that. And, God knows there's a lot of fodder for columnists there. He's the gift that keeps on giving from childish cat
You know,
lady
it, it's been
postmenopausal women.
Yes, it's been really interesting to watch these old podcasts and interviews being dug up by people, by opposition researchers, basically on JD Vance. And it just strikes me, this guy is good. He is smart. He's incredibly articulate. I see him in interviews. He doesn't back down for 1 second. You can't corner him particularly. He's just really, really good at what he's been brought aboard to the Trump campaign to do. And he also has this real Silicon Valley, bro-y, Joe Rogan-y kind of way of talking about women that I think he's trying to backtrack on because he knows how offensive it is. But when he sits and tells a podcaster, that the role of postmenopausal women is to take care of grandchildren, to help out families, it's like in one fell swoop, just saying to women, your vessels, you carry the babies, and then after you're done carrying the babies and raising the babies, then you're going to care for somebody else's babies. And it's just it flies in the face, first of all, of his own personal experience. He has a wife who has a law degree and has clerked for a Supreme Court judge. He has a mother-in-law, an immigrant, and immigrants he's constantly bashing, who is a tenured professor, I think, at UC San Diego in biology. I mean, everything about his life contradicts his rhetoric. And I think people are starting to see through it, particularly women.
Yeah, I mean, a couple other things that you've written about in this area recently is childcare. Trump had that totally incomprehensible answer when he
Yeah, yeah,
talked about
yeah.
childcare. He appears not to have thought about it previously.
Did he
Um,
talk? Did he switch? Did he segue to tariffs or something? I can't remember what he said.
I think it
Or
was,
illegal
yeah,
immigration. It was like
we're
something
going to
that
pay
was
for it with the tariffs.
nonsensical. Yeah, nonsensical.
But I mean, you had the historic perspective that this is like not a new issue, that during World War,
Not at all. Yes, during World
the
War
government
II,
had programs for it.
and the Kaiser
Is that a
shipyards were
voting
leaders.
issue? Is that a
Uh,
voting? Do you think?
It's really interesting to me. I've been writing about childcare probably almost my entire career. And I remember when I first got to the LA Times more than 30 years ago, I was assigned to write a 10-part series on childcare. And I said, why are you asking me, a person who does not have children yet, to write about childcare? But they gave me the assignment. I wrote this, comprehensive series all about how we give so much lip service to the importance of raising children and the importance of taking care of children, and we never put our money where our mouth is. And there's always this giant gap between what we say about children and really how we support them. And so, yes, it's an enduring issue. The thing about childcare, though, most parents need childcare when their kids are fairly young, like 0 to school age. So in a sense, it's a transitory issue, right? Because once your kid is old enough to start going to aftercare at school, then you're no longer in that terrible financial bind and struggle over, making ends meet while paying the babysitter or the daycare provider and doing your job at the office and trying to get your partner, usually a man, to, help out and pitch in. So it's an eternal issue, but it's one with I guess, a constituency that churns every few years. And so it's hard to always keep it in focus.
Yeah. And it also goes to something else you wrote about recently, which is one of the bases of Trump's support, which is, Christian nationalism and traditional
Oh, yeah,
family roles in that, which is
yeah.
doesn't get talked a lot about, but I think is the
Yeah, I mean, I think we've come to understand that while the Christian evangelical vote was always sought after and has been sought after, of course, and successfully so by Republicans in the last, I want to say 40 years, um, There's been a shift in that voting bloc and that part of the population, whereas evangelical Christians used to be non-political. Now I think it's fair to say that when we talk about evangelical Christians, white evangelical Christians, we're talking about white nationalists. And we are talking about people who yearn for a world that doesn't exist anymore, a world that was white, where women were subservient, where the children could be homeschooled, where the men were in charge, and where immigrants didn't factor into the community except as low wage, domestic workers and farm workers. The country has changed, the demographics have changed. And I think what this sort of new iteration of the Christian nationalist movement is a reaction to the changing demographics. It's a continuing reaction to the election of our first Black president, a continuing reaction to Donald Trump's over-the-top rhetoric about our borders and illegals poisoning the blood of our country and changing our genes. And it gets at this very, very profound discomfort that a lot of conservative white evangelicals have with the way the world is changing. And I mean, what you're seeing is a very powerful backlash to progress. I mean, this country elected its first Black president, and that was really fantastic. And it was a milestone. But there has been a backlash brewing in the establishment and the religious establishment that was not going to let this just happen and happen again. This is my belief. I mean, people can disagree with me, but I just think the country is changing, and there is a subset of people who are politically engaged, who are distressed by the changes and don't want them to happen, and who are, as a result, looking toward this authoritarian daddy figure to maintain to make it great again, to reel us back, 50 years to a time when the white male power structure was fully in control. And it's not
Yeah.
anymore, and it's not going to be.
Yeah, I read somewhere that Trump's real intention is to repeal the 20th century. I don't know if it goes
Couldn't have put it better myself. But yes, I mean
that
it's
far
always when
back,
you
but you had a piece not too long ago, as a year or so ago, about Ms. Magazine. They were celebrating their 50th anniversary, and that you went through the first issue, and it was
yeah.
like, wait a minute,
It's
nothing really
contemporary.
has changed, because it did seem for a long time like quote unquote
Yeah.
progress was being made
Right.
any number of social and cultural issues, but not so much.
Yeah, and I mean, you see this, I mean, in Dobbs, of course, which overturned Roe versus Wade. And then after the protests in, was it 2020, 2021, the Black Lives Matter protests, what you saw was particular companies and institutions rushing into the DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion world, and probably in a way that was half-assed, if not half-hearted, because there became not that long after a big backlash, to efforts to I mean, it was perceived as affirmative action, which has been ruled illegal all over the place. And so the idea was that, but we still have this racial imbalance in our institutions and in government and in companies and schools. And so there's got to be some way to try to make it better. But this has been exploited by the right. To in the same vein that they rail against immigrants. They don't want the world to change, and they don't. I mean, I think Michelle Obama had a fantastic line at the Democratic convention. She talked about the affirmative action of inherited wealth, and it was a direct dig at Donald Trump. And this is the issue. The idea of white privilege, I don't care what people say, it's real. There's no way around it. And the idea that many white families have been able to, build equity in real estate and so on, which was denied to Black families. There's just this idea that white people have struggled to get where they are, but Black people only got there because of affirmative action. And that strain of thought, which is, BS, exists completely and fully still in the Republican Party today, the MAGA Republican Party.
And you saw it aimed pretty directly at Harris during the campaign with a
Oh, yeah.
DEI candidate. I mean,
Yes, right.
it
I
was
mean, the
just
idea that Donald Trump says this is a woman who was district attorney of San Francisco, attorney general of California, a senator in the United States Senate, and a vice president of the United States. He says she's stupid. I mean, that alone, and lazy, that alone, those are racist tropes used against her. And the fact that he called her, Black identity into question when he spoke to the Black Journalists Association. It's just, it's shocking to me that the rhetoric, nothing stops him. And the rhetoric, the racist rhetoric gets worse and worse and worse. We saw the kerfuffle that so-called comedian caused over the weekend at Madison Square Garden by saying there's a, floating trash in the ocean. It's called Puerto Rico. I mean, that I think people talk about an October surprise. I'm thinking, maybe this can be the thing that will like turn the election, and those people who are on the fence will see, these people are flat out racist and they're proud of it.
yeah. And it was so, I mean, it was so heavy-handed, it even sort of overshadowed Tucker Carlson, which is hard to do. He was
That was impressive. Yeah.
also speaking, but just to close on this subject that you, a piece you wrote about, which I thought was really interesting because I hadn't really thought about it before, about how women in the Republican Party succeed by sort of taking, I mean, they have to shoot things and sort of look like they're on Fox News and all. I think it was about Christine Nome, the
Yeah.
governor's
Yeah. It was
that
the
when it
dog
came
killer.
out. But there was a broader, I mean, there was a broader truth there.
Well, it's funny because here's the bind that we're in. And I am speaking as a former fashion editor, by the way, who wrote a lot about beauty and clothing and went to Milan and London and Paris and covered the shows when I worked at the Detroit Free Press. So I feel pretty comfortable in this sphere. And I know that we're not really allowed to, remark about women's looks. It's not fair, it's sexist, but I'm sorry. There is a place where you can remark upon it. And if you look, for example, at photographs of Kristi Noem before she embraced the MAGA and after, that woman has had a ton of plastic surgery and work and teeth. And, there's a certain sort of Barbie doll aspect to a lot of these Republican women. Which harkens back to this idea of the trad wife, even though, like Phyllis Schlafly, they're out there working and leaving their kids in the care of babysitters, but they're out there sort of pushing this return to traditional roles. And they are, I think, those Republican women and the Kardashians, I would say, are probably responsible for a lot of the dysphoria among teenagers today because they showcase this way of appearing that is so unrealistic and requires so much money to maintain that it makes kids just and young women go, oh my God, I don't look like that. What's wrong with me? I don't think it's a very healthy development, but I think it's also this like ultra hyper femininity thing that you see on the Republican side is definitely a subliminal call, to the 50s housewife, to Donna Reed and, that world.
Yeah, let me pick up on that point about dysphoria among teenagers because you've written a fair
Yeah.
amount about this, and it really does. I mean, it's not a big mystery that it goes to social media, which
Yeah.
back it up a step, and then we're talking about smartphones and that kind of thing. Uh, to what extent do you think that the smartphone, social media itself, has helped to kind of create this cultural moment that we find ourselves in, certainly with the election as the most prominent manifestation of it, but just the way that our consumption of information has become so atomized and so
Yeah.
individualized.
Yeah, there's that. And there's all, yes, like you never have to come outside of your bubble if you don't want, because everybody's not sitting watching, the three major news networks to get their news. And one of the things I've noticed over the years with social media and the internet and the explosion of all kinds of digital information sources is that there was a time when I was covering, let's say, the 2004 campaign between John Kerry and George Bush, his reelection. there were things that I knew from being on the road and talking to all the, consultants and the aides about politics that other people didn't know. And people, I'd come home and my family would say, so what about this? What about that? Well, today everybody knows everything in real time. All you have to do is go onto Twitter or X, go onto Threads, go on whatever. Everybody knows everything. And so our job as journalists has kind of changed to become, I think, in a way more interpretive, which works for me, of course, as a columnist. Um, but it is a world where everybody knows everything at the same time. And because of all the disinformation and misinformation out there, I think these like lies like the stop the steal and this terrible things that Donald Trump promulgates that are all lies just have gotten, their hooks into people's brains. And it's very difficult to disabuse people. I remain shocked by the number of people who are still willing to embrace the lie that Donald Trump won the 2020 election. It shocks me. And you can say, well, 60 courts throughout those legal cases. And there's just a kind of doesn't matter, he won.
Deep state. That's all part of the deep state.
Deep state. Yes. And by the way, I think I heard that Steve Bannon is getting out of prison today or tomorrow.
Yeah, and he said he's
That'll
gonna
be fun.
jump right back into it. I
I'm
know.
sure he will. Yeah.
Can't wait. I can't wait for that. But in a sense, I mean, what you just described has kind of destroyed the whole idea of news as something that people consume as a separate category of anything else. I mean, news is what is ever is on your phone, which
Yeah, that's true. That's absolutely true. And so, you can't, but the news is coming from somewhere, right? So somebody is out there being the reporter who is producing the news. And while you can curate your news intake, there's still reporters on the ground, people who are investigating government officials who are doing the spade work of bringing you the information that you wouldn't necessarily have. One of my favorite tropes is when people say, how come no one's talking about the fact that, oh, let's say that Donald Trump met with Jeff Bezos's space executives right after Jeff
right.
Bezos decided to withhold the endorsement from Kamala Harris. I mean, people are talking about it. And the reason they're talking about it is because reporters reported the information. So this idea that nobody's talking about things always kind of makes me laugh because there's a reason you know about it, and it's thanks to a reporter.
Yeah. But with everyone doing their own research, as
Oh,
we
yeah.
like to say,
Like
it's
on vaccines, for
I mean, it's
example.
just obviously, I mean, it's an obvious thing to say, but the loss of a shared sense of facts, of a shared sense of reality. I mean, historians will go back to that Kelly Conway interview the first weekend of the Trump thing, alternative facts. I mean, little did we
Yeah,
know at the
yeah.
time how that was gonna
I
just
mean, I think we knew that first when Sean Spicer tried to tell the lie that the inauguration crowd was the largest in world history. I mean, it began from day one. And you know what? It works for him. It works for Trump. Disregarding the truth and just marching on. It's shocking, but he tells disgruntled people what they want to hear. And that's what they hear and that's what they believe. And I, like you, I'm boggled all the time that we no longer have a common set of facts that we can call truth. Um, but Adam Schiff used to say that when he was running the impeachment, and I remember talking to him quite a bit during that time, that eventually the fever is going to break. The fever will break, and we will. And so every time I see Adam Schiff, I say, Congressman, has the fever broken yet? And pretty soon I'll be saying, Senator, has the
senator.
fever
Yeah, you
broken yet? The fever just is not breaking. And anyway,
Yeah. Well, let me ask you this. You mentioned Bezos in the Washington Post, but uh, we, of course, in Santa Barbara pioneered the billionaire owner wrecking the newspaper. But
and kudos to you.
yeah, thanks a lot. But it's been much in the news in the last week that at the LA Times, the owner,
Yeah.
Patrick Soon
Shong.
Shong, if I'm pronouncing, yeah, okay.
Yes.
Uh, basically torpedoed an endorsement of Harris that was forthcoming. There have been a number
Yeah,
of resignations on the editorial
yeah.
page. How has that kind of landed at the paper? Because we
Well,
all count on it, so we're
it landed with a big fat thud. Um, I will say this. I would not compare Patrick Soon-Shiong or Jeff Bezos to Wendy McCaw. Okay. They, whatever her issues were, they did, I believe, by the Washington Post and by the LA Times with the idea of maintaining a legacy and an operation, and they believed in the democratic or the value of newspapers in a democracy. I mean, that's the Washington Post motto, democracy dies in darkness. However, I think, there comes a moment in a billionaire's life where the billionaire has to decide, am I looking out for my company? And what's the harm in, pulling an endorsement? Here's what I think is happening, although neither billionaire has copped to this. I think that both have business with the federal government. The rocket contracts with Bezos and Amazon, and the postal rates that Trump tried to raise on Amazon. And Patrick Soon-Shiong is a creative medical entrepreneur who has develops drugs, cancer drugs, and has applications pending before the FDA. Okay, so both of these guys, a chunk of their businesses, I don't know how much, depends on cooperation with the federal government or cooperation from the federal government. So I think what they know is what we all kind of can figure out. If Kamala Harris wins, she's not going to engage in vindictive, punishment for people who didn't support her. That's not who she is. She's a mature adult, capable of seeing past that political stuff. Whereas Donald Trump is not. He has promised retribution against, prosecutors, politicians, business people, you name it. I think quite simply, this is a form of hedging their bets. And it's disappointing, and it has led to resignations at both the Washington Post and the Los Angeles Times. I do think it's indefensible. And I wish they would be transparent about what they're doing. Instead, we've gotten some very muddied explanations at the Los Angeles Times, including the owner's adult daughter, who, as far as I know, has nothing to do with the newspaper or its editorial operation, saying that her family sat down and decided they were not going to endorse Harris because of the Biden administration's support of Benjamin Netanyahu and the havoc he has wreaked in Gaza in payback for October 7th. This came as complete news to everybody on our editorial board. And Patrick Soon-Shiong himself said that's not the case. His daughter is not involved in endorsements or in any aspect of the Los Angeles Times. So what does this mean? I don't know. I mean, we're all sort of like, well, what's going on? What's the real story? We'd like to know. We are the employees. We are the backbone of the newspaper. Please tell us.
Yeah. Well, and the key word there, of course, is transparency because,
Yeah,
newspapers love to report on what powerful people are doing. And
exactly.
so they ought to be reporting on it.
Well,
And I
yeah,
see Jim Rainey finally, I think it was Jim,
it
had a
was.
piece in the Times that talked about it. But these explanations that, oh, the guy at the Post there, we're returning to our roots, 11 days before the election. I mean, yes, you can certainly make a case that newspapers shouldn't
Sure.
endorse people, but come on, don't try to hang your hat on some phony principle, 2 weeks.
Well, I think it's particularly not incriminating. That's wrong, probably too strong a word, but notable that both of these newspapers are owned by billionaires, and both in got to the point where their editorial boards had written the Kamala Harris endorsements, and then they pulled them at the last minute without a very good explanation. And so, it's disingenuous, I think, the explanations from both papers. The other thing is, if you had said 3 years ago, you know what, we're going to change our endorsement policy, we're going to let people make up their own minds. But the point is, people always make up their own minds anyway, even if you endorse. I mean, and we just endorsed Adam Schiff for the US Senate. We endorsed George Gascon, the very controversial district attorney in Los Angeles, who is all about crime reform and social justice. And we endorsed every other measure on the ballot. So to suddenly say we want our readers to make up their own minds is completely disingenuous. It really makes no sense. And people can smell that.
Yeah,
They know when they're being, you know,
yeah.
when there's a smoke screen, I guess.
And, I have a great respect for those and also sympathy for those who resigned. But I have to say, that I don't think it's a good idea for people to cancel their subscriptions. I understand that, yeah,
I
people are
know.
angry and it's, they feel misled maybe by the owner of their paper, but not
The thing is,
good.
yeah, I'm not a fan of cancellations and boycotts philosophically, really, and my best friend canceled her subscription to the Times, and she's a 40-year subscriber, so that hurt. But I understand it, and I understand that people think it's the only way they can register their anger and disappointment. But you're right, it does hurt the journalists, and particularly at the LA Times, we've been through a series of layoffs, cutbacks. Our newsroom has shrunk incredibly over the past, well, 20 years, but in the past 5 years since Patrick has owned us, we've had at least two rounds of layoffs. And so we're all working really hard, we're like ducks. We're paddling as fast as we can under the water. And, it hurts that, but here's the thing, I totally understand because
Sure.
readers don't feel like they have any alternative to way to express their opinions. And we've been getting lots of letters from people saying, listen, please don't take this personally. We know how hard the journalists at the LA Times work. We know the good stuff that you guys do, but we just can't sit this one out. We just have to take a stand. I'm hoping those people will come back after the election. Maybe we'll
Yeah.
see. But my fear is that they won't. And that's terrible right now for us, really
Yeah.
bad.
So do you think that the owner, sort of figured, oh, I'll take some heat from this, but I don't care? Or do you think it was just caught him by surprise because it's not really his business and maybe didn't understand what the reaction would be?
Yeah, I have to think he was taken by surprise. Because particularly of the way it was couched. It's like we're doing your readers a favor. He said that he had asked the editorial board to like do a kind of comparison to, policies of Kamala Harris, policies of Donald Trump. But the problem is Kamala Harris has never been president. She's vice president. Trump has been president and has a record, a 4-year record that we know of. And that's more properly the kind of analysis that's left to the news pages. Uh,
Absolutely. That's what news pages do.
it
That
is.
was
That's
always
what news
like the
pages
bottom
do.
guy in the political
Yeah.
desk. Hey, go
So
with it.
this is why I think this adds to this suspicion that this is a disingenuous reason for pulling
And,
the endorsement.
let's face it, it's, Kamala Harris, for whatever her faults, and I've written about them. I mean, she is someone squarely in the mainstream of American politics and the American tradition. The other guy is not.
Yeah,
He's very different.
I would say she has a reverence for the Constitution that's missing on the other side. I'm also, at a loss to explain the Supreme Court's recent decision about presidential immunity. It's just insane. And there was a very funny Doonesbury comic. I don't know if you saw it today or yesterday about what Joe Biden was in the White House. It was a thought bubble coming out of the White House saying, what do I do if Kamala Harris wins and, Trump spends the next 2 months fomenting violence and anger against the system. And somebody said, well, you could put him in jail, official act. And like, yeah, did the Supreme Court really understand what they were unleashing with this immunity for official act
I
stuff?
don't,
They
yeah,
just,
that's a great question. I mean, based on just what I've read about Roberts and what he thought about it, it seemed like, his version of, oh, let's not endorse and maybe nobody will notice.
precisely. Yes, that man lives in a bubble that is, and I became aware of this when he threw out the heart of the Voting Rights Act several years ago, saying we no longer have these kinds of issues in our
Yes.
country. And the reason that we don't have those issues is because we have the Voting Rights Act. Now that he gutted it, basically. We're seeing all kinds of election chicanery going on in these states. So he doesn't seem to live in the real world exactly. And he seems to think, that as he's calling balls and strikes as an umpire, he's really putting his thumb on the scale, to mix a metaphor, for Trump and the MAGA Republicans.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. Well, listen, every time I give a speech, Robin, after I get introduced, I say that thank you. I can't wait to hear what I have to say. And
Yeah,
I'm
that's
guessing you're in that same
and
situation.
I'll have an idea what I'll say after the election, I
Yeah.
think.
Yeah.
So yeah, but thank you so much. It was really a pleasure meeting you and
And we
talking
look
to you.
forward to seeing you in Santa Barbara, November
Thank you.
12th.
Lovely.
Thank you very much, Robin and Karen.
All right,
Thanks for
Jerry.
taking the time to
Thanks.
speak
Take
with us
care.
today.
It was my
Take care.
pleasure.
Bye-bye.